Good evening and welcome aboard Eternal Drift. Tonight we set sail into the vast and unforgiving depths of the open sea, where luxury meets nightmare. The first night aboard the luxury cruise ship felt surreal. The decks glittered under artificial lights, the ocean stretched infinitely around, and the laughter of passengers mingled with the distant hum of the engines. But from the moment we stepped aboard, a subtle unease gnawed at the edges of my mind, a feeling that the opulence hiding in the ship's polished corridors masked something darker. At first, it was small things, shadows that seemed to flicker at the edge of vision, whispers carried by the cold night wind, and the odd metallic smell that lingered in the hallways without explanation. Passengers joked about seasickness. The crew offered smiles too practiced, and yet I felt eyes watching from places where no one should be. By the second night, the unease had grown into a suffocating presence. People began disappearing. First a couple who had gone out to the deck in the storm, then a young woman from the spa whose laughter had been silenced mid-echo. The crew claimed no one had left the ship, yet their eyes avoided questions. Their hands trembled slightly when they passed in the corridors, and the announcements over the intercom sounded distorted, as if someone else, something else, were speaking. In the bowels of the ship, the corridors twisted unnaturally. Stairwells led to walls, doors opened into darkness, and lights flickered like hesitant heartbeats. I remember seeing a figure at the end of a hall drenched in shadows, moving impossibly fast, vanishing when approached. The air smelled of salt and rust, and somewhere deep below, a low vibration hummed, a pulse in the metal itself, like the heartbeat of the ship awakening. We tried to gather in groups, seeking safety in numbers, but the ship seemed alive, rearranging itself. Rooms we had memorized disappeared. Hallways looped back impossibly. Panic set in. Attempts to contact the outside world failed. Radios and phones picked up only static and occasionally faint, horrifying murmurs. You can't leave. You'll never leave. People began to lose their grip on reality. The walls whispered secrets. The mirrors reflected figures that weren't there, and the water outside churned black, alive with shapes that seemed to follow the ship's movements. One by one, friends vanished in ways impossible to explain. Some swallowed by the floor, others pulled through windows that shouldn't exist, leaving screams behind that echoed endlessly through the corridors. By the fourth night, survival instincts overrode all else. We realized the ship was not just a vessel, but a predator, conscious, deliberate, feeding on fear, despair, and attention. Every shadow, every sudden noise, every flicker of light had purpose. It was testing us, torturing us, learning from us. By the fifth night, the few of us left had stopped sleeping. Eyes hollow, voices barely above whispers, we wandered corridors that no longer seemed built by humans. The ship had grown a mind of its own. Doors would slam shut behind us, isolating us in sections that weren't on the map. The metal floors groaned like the sighs of tortured souls. From somewhere deep within, a slow scraping noise, wet and deliberate, traveled along the hull, always just out of sight, always drawing nearer. It was in the dining hall that we first saw them. Shadows, human shapes twisted and contorted yet eerily still, standing in the corners watching. At first we thought they were other passengers lost in delirium, but as we approached, their faces melted into voids, eyes black hollows, mouths whispering things we could almost hear and never forget. When one of us screamed, the shadows rippled like liquid, sliding across the floor, walls, and ceiling to surround him. His voice cut off mid-sentence, replaced by a wet, echoing gurgle, and then silence. We ran. The hallways stretched endlessly, twisting like ribbons in a storm. Every door we tried to open led to more darkness, more whispers. Our flashlights flickered, catching glimpses of figures that moved impossibly fast, sometimes appearing directly in front of us, sometimes reflected behind us in mirrors that hadn't been there before. Panic tore at our throats as the reality we knew slipped away. Water began leaking into lower decks, not the usual seawater, but a thick black substance that smelled of iron and decay. It moved like living ink, curling toward us, licking at our boots. When it touched the metal walls, it hissed, leaving streaks of shadow that lingered even after the liquid receded. It was as though the ship's veins themselves were poisoning us, marking us, drawing us deeper into its consciousness. Voices began calling our names. Familiar voices, loved ones long gone, or perhaps just figments, but always laced with a cruel mockery. Following them, we discovered a locked room deep in the engine bay. The door had no handle, Yet it swung open under the weight of fear. Inside, hundreds of small, twisted dolls lay scattered, their eyes impossibly lifelike, each resembling someone who had vanished. We realized then that the ship didn't just take people, it preserved them, corrupted them, making their essence part of its being. The storm outside escalated, waves smashing against the hull, but the ship barely rocked. It was as if the ocean itself obeyed its will. Attempts to radio for help were met with distorted voices whispering threats. "You belong here. You are ours." Every escape route closed as the ship seemed to anticipate our moves. Stairwells ended in blank walls. Doors opened to nothing but the abyss of the ocean. We tried to barricade ourselves in cabins, but even there the air grew thick and heavy. Objects moved on their own. Lights flickered in Morse-like patterns, spelling out messages we couldn't read. Footsteps echoed outside, slow, deliberate, sometimes stopping right at our doors. Sleep was impossible. The whispers crawled into our minds, forcing visions of drowning, suffocation, and endless drifting into the cold, black water. By the seventh night, we were reduced to a handful. Our minds frayed, our voices hoarse from shouting into emptiness. The ship's full hunger revealed itself. Entire corridors would vanish, then return, filled with shapes of the missing, faces screaming silently, bodies contorted unnaturally, watching, waiting. There was no mercy, no logic, no escape, only fear, sustained and endless. By the eighth night, reality had dissolved entirely. The ship no longer resembled a vessel built by humans. It had become a labyrinth of nightmares. Corridors bent at impossible angles, ceilings stretched higher than the eye could see, and staircases led downward into darkness so absolute it seemed to consume sound itself. The few of us remaining clung to each other, but even our voices seemed to be swallowed before reaching anyone's ears. I remember seeing a man vanish mid-step. One moment he was beside me, trembling, whispering about a shadow that followed him. The next, his body stretched unnaturally, elongated like taffy before being absorbed into the wall with a wet, sucking sound. His screams lingered in the air, echoing endlessly as though the ship itself had memorized them. The water had begun to creep into higher decks now, black and viscous, leaving a trail of decay in its wake. We tried to avoid it, but even standing on furniture didn't save us. The liquid moved in patterns, forming grotesque symbols that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. One moment a symbol would be simple. The next it twisted into a face, grinning with impossible teeth, whispering our names in tones only our minds could hear. Sleep was impossible. Hallucinations bled into reality. I saw my own reflection in a window, smiling back at me, mocking while I screamed silently. Whispers promised salvation if only we surrendered, but the promises were lies, bait for the terrified. Shadows began to detach themselves from walls, crawling across the floor toward us like black liquid, shaping into grotesque parodies of human forms. We discovered a hatch leading below the lowest deck, covered in rust and slime. It pulsed under our hands, alive as if the ship's heart beat there. One by one we descended, hoping for an exit, but the air grew warmer and heavier, smelling of decay and old blood. The engine room was no longer mechanical. It had become organic, a writhing mass of metal fused with sinew-like cables. Lights flickered, illuminating the shapes of the missing passengers, trapped in grotesque positions, their eyes hollow yet aware, staring at us with silent warning. A sudden tremor shook the deck above, and we realized the ship was not just alive, it was hunting us. It knew our fears, our weaknesses, and it tailored the environment to exploit them. One crew member, terrified of water, found the floor beneath him liquefying, pulling him down screaming until only a hand remained visible for a fleeting second before vanishing entirely. Another, paralyzed by darkness, was swallowed by a corridor that stretched into nothingness, leaving only echoes of terror behind. I tried to keep a record, scrawling messages on walls with chalk, but they faded as quickly as they were written. The ship mocked us through these ephemeral notes, rewriting our own fears against us. Every heartbeat, every shiver, every tear fed its awareness. We were not just trapped physically, we were trapped psychologically, spiritually, with no possibility of relief. By now, time had lost meaning. Days and nights blended into an endless cycle of terror. We realized the ship had been feeding on more than our fear. It was consuming our sense of identity, eroding who we were. Each of us began hearing voices in our heads speaking as us, reflecting our own thoughts back in twisted, horrifying ways. Decisions felt impossible. Even movement became a challenge, as if the corridors themselves resisted, pushing us back, isolating us further. By the 9th night, we had lost all sense of safety. The ship no longer obeyed the rules of physics, space, or time. Corridors stretched endlessly, doors led into infinite darkness, and stairwells twisted back upon themselves, trapping us in loops. The air was thick, almost tangible, pressing against our lungs with the weight of unseen hands. Every movement was met with resistance, as if the ship itself resented our presence. The shadows had grown bolder. They no longer waited at the edges of our vision. They approached directly, slithering along walls, floors, and ceilings. Faces emerged from the darkness, twisted into grotesque parodies of the missing passengers. Their mouths whispered secrets we weren't meant to know, voices that carried memories of our worst fears and regrets. One figure, a child smiling innocently, stretched its arms toward me, only for the skin to melt away, revealing blackened sinews and a hollow void where the face should have been. I ran, but the corridor behind me had vanished, leaving only walls that pulsed like a living organism. Water surged again, faster this time, black and thick, filling rooms almost instantly. Those who stood in it screamed as the substance wrapped around them, cold and suffocating, dragging them into the floorboards. I saw a friend vanish, pulled into the black tide. His scream echoed endlessly, though his body never returned. The ship seemed to savor the terror, amplifying every sound, every heartbeat, turning it into a chorus of madness. I stumbled into a room filled with mirrors. Dozens of reflections stared back at me, each one moving independently, grinning, screaming, twisting into horrifying shapes. One reflection reached out, its hand breaching the glass, and I felt a cold, clawing grip close around my wrist. I tore myself free, but the image remained, watching, waiting, whispering my name over and over until it became indistinguishable from my own voice. Attempts to escape proved futile. Decks I remembered were gone, replaced by black voids or endless walls of steel. Even the ocean outside had changed. It shimmered unnaturally, reflecting shapes beneath the surface that moved with intent. Large humanoid forms swam beneath us, their eyes glowing, following, feeding off the fear that radiated from the ship. At one point, the railing itself tried to pull me overboard, bending and stretching as though alive, the water beyond opening like a maw ready to swallow me whole. The remaining passengers and crew were no longer human. Eyes hollowed, voices hoarse, they whispered constantly, either in warning or in madness. One man tried to resist, banging on the hull, shouting at the storm, pleading for rescue. The ship responded with a violent shudder, walls bending inward, trapping him, compressing the air until only a distorted, muffled scream remained. I realized then the horrifying truth. The cruise had never been about leisure or adventure. The ship was alive, sentient, and malevolent. It existed to trap, to consume, to immortalize terror. Every shadow, every flicker of light, every sound was deliberate. Every heartbeat, every thought, every drop of fear fed it. Escape was impossible. The ocean itself had become an extension of the ship, a prison without walls, without mercy. By the 10th night, there were only 3 of us left. We had stopped speaking, communicating only with desperate gestures. The corridors whispered our names constantly, the walls shifting, closing in, rearranging themselves to isolate us. I saw the faces of the missing, trapped in the walls, screaming silently, warning, mocking, beckoning. And then the whispers changed. They were no longer outside. They were inside my mind, chanting promises of release if I surrendered to the ship's will. We tried one last desperate attempt, running toward the bow, hoping for some escape into the storm. But the ship anticipated. The deck stretched, warped, folding upon itself. Figures rose from the black waters, half human, half shadow, reaching for us. The wind carried laughter, not human, not natural, deep, resonant, mocking. As we ran, I felt the ship's consciousness brushing against my mind, tasting my terror, learning, laughing, feeding. The realization struck. This was never a ship. It was a predator, immortal, insatiable. It didn't just travel the ocean, it owned it. Every heartbeat, every glance, every terrified thought became part of its being. There was no escape, no rescue, only the endless cycle of fear, despair, and submission. And as the final moments closed in, I understood that the ship had already decided. We would become one with it. Our identities absorbed, our memories preserved, our terror immortalized in the living metal forever. By the 11th night, the ship had consumed what little sanity remained. The corridors no longer had floors. They were endless voids of black stretching infinitely. Walls breathed. Ceilings pulsed like lungs. Every step forward felt like sinking deeper into the bowels of some living nightmare. The few remaining of us were shadows ourselves, trembling, whispering to one another, knowing words could not save us. Then the ship spoke. Directly. Not through creaks, whispers, or reflections, but inside our minds. Its voice was everywhere, impossible to ignore, echoing simultaneously in every thought. You belong. You are mine, forever. My chest tightened. I tried to scream, but my voice betrayed me, becoming part of the chorus that filled the ship. The walls responded, stretching and bending in harmony with its command. I saw the others, my friends, my companions, those who had survived this far, twisting unnaturally as if the ship were rewriting their forms. Limbs elongated and disappeared, eyes stretched wide and then hollowed, mouths opened in silent screams that I could feel echo in my bones. My stomach churned as I realized we were not being killed, not yet, but rewritten, reshaped into the essence of fear itself. The black waters outside became alive, crawling onto the deck like thick oil, reaching for us with appendages that mimicked human hands. Shapes emerged from within, familiar faces distorted beyond recognition, beckoning, dragging, pressing their will against ours. One by one, the remaining passengers were pulled in, screaming until only I remained, running, stumbling, slipping in the viscous black liquid that smelled of iron and decay. I reached the bow, desperately searching for escape, some shred of sanity to cling to. The wind howled and lightning illuminated the horrors I could barely comprehend. The ship stretched endlessly, a cathedral of nightmare, its decks folding like pages of a dark tome, corridors looping into themselves, doors opening into more doors, reflections multiplying infinitely. I realized I had nowhere to go. Then, the ship revealed its final horror. The water beneath me rose, alive with the shapes of all those who had vanished before. Their eyes met mine, hollow and accusing. I felt their fear, their pain, their confusion, and the ship's hunger. It wasn't merely feeding on terror. It was preserving it, perfecting it, making us part of its eternal consciousness. The last thing I remember before everything went black was its whisper, louder than all the storms, louder than the crashing waves. Your fear is beautiful. Your despair is mine. Welcome to eternity, and then silence. Not peace, but an endless, suffocating stillness. The ship drifted, calm now, carrying its new passengers within its living metal and endless darkness. Somewhere, deep below, the black waters churned with the memories of those it had claimed, feeding the ship's consciousness, waiting for the next vessel, the next souls, the next fear. We were gone. Only the ship remained, eternal, insatiable, and ever hungry. Even after the final moments, the terror didn't stop. The corridors seemed to breathe with a life of their own. I wandered alone, but never truly alone, because the ship was aware of me at every second. Each step I took was followed by whispers, faint at first, then rising to deafening levels. Each voice a distorted echo of someone I once knew, or someone I thought I knew. Doors I had memorized no longer led to the expected rooms. One door opened to a ballroom frozen in time, chandeliers swinging violently despite no breeze, shadows dancing along the walls as if mocking my fear. A mirror along the far wall reflected dozens of versions of myself, each twisting in agony, screaming silently. When I moved closer, the reflections moved independently, advancing toward me, their eyes black voids that swallowed all light. I stumbled into the kitchen, hoping for some familiarity, but even here, horror awaited. Pots and pans floated mid-air, spinning in unnatural patterns. The smell of spoiled food and rust mixed with something acrid, almost alive. Shadows formed in the corners, bending, reaching, whispering threats. You cannot leave. You are ours. I tried to grab a flashlight, but it melted in my hands, dripping like black tar onto the floor, pooling and crawling toward me. In the engine room, the horrors deepened. The machinery had fused with organic matter. Pipes pulsated like veins, pumping thick black liquid dripping onto the floor. The walls seemed to breathe. Screams echoed from nowhere and everywhere at once, and I saw figures trapped in the machinery. Bodies twisted, faces contorted in permanent terror. The ship wasn't just alive, it was consuming, shaping, evolving from the very fear it harvested. At one point, I was dragged down a corridor by an unseen force. The walls closed in, the floor beneath me rippling like water. I tried to resist, but the ship was stronger than me, stronger than any human. When I looked up, the ceiling opened into infinite darkness, and from it shadows poured like a flood, each one an amalgamation of people who had vanished before. They reached for me, whispering names, promises, threats, memories I had never shared, but they knew. The ship knew. It knew everything. The few times I tried to shout for help, my voice returned distorted, twisted into a chorus of screams from the lost passengers. The echoes themselves seemed sentient, mocking, pushing me further into despair. I realized the ship wasn't just a predator. It was a collector of identity. Each fear, each scream, each desperate thought became part of it, woven into the very metal and wood of its being. Even the ocean had changed. From the observation deck, I could see the black waters teeming with shapes, writhing beneath the surface. Eyes reflected the moonlight, glowing faintly, watching me, following me. Occasionally, a hand would break the surface, long and unnatural, reaching as though to drag me under. Waves crashed, but no water splashed. Instead, the black tide slithered like living oil, moving with intent. Sleep was impossible. The ship denied it. Shadows appeared even in the darkened corners, whispering secrets I could barely comprehend. Mirrors reflected impossible images, sometimes me, sometimes the others, sometimes creatures that were neither human nor animal. One reflection leaned out of the glass and spoke directly to me, voice my own. Give in. Join us. Become part of the whole. As the days, or what felt like days, passed, I understood the ship's cruel intelligence. It studied us, probed our weaknesses, amplified our fears. Even the smallest panic could twist into something monstrous. I watched a man collapse, terrified of heights, and the walls themselves seemed to stretch upward, pulling him into the ceiling until his screams turned to whispers. Then silence. Another reached for a door that no longer existed, falling into a void where he became part of the blackness itself. By now I moved mechanically, my mind fraying, thoughts half-formed, half-eaten by the constant whispers. The ship's voice was always there, a low hum at first, then rising in crescendos. You are mine. You are perfect. You are fear. And I realized it wasn't only my body the ship wanted. It wanted my essence, my terror, my memories, my very soul. The following moments stretched into what felt like eternity. Time had no meaning on the ship. Days, nights, storms, all melded into one unending nightmare. The corridors twisted and shifted unpredictably, often looping back on themselves. I ran in circles, chased by whispers, shadows, and memories of those who had vanished, until my legs burned and my lungs ached. I stumbled into a lounge that had once been elegant. Now it was warped, as if the very fabric of the room had been stitched by a mad hand. Furniture floated, spinning slowly in the thick air. The carpet rippled like liquid, undulating under my feet. Portraits on the walls stared with eyes that moved, following me, grinning with grotesque delight. I recognized faces, friends, family, crew, but they were wrong. Mouths opened impossibly wide, eyes empty, voices echoing in unison. You cannot escape. In the chaos, I discovered a staircase that spiraled downward into total darkness. Something compelled me to descend. Each step was slick with black liquid, and the walls hummed, vibrating in tune with some invisible heartbeat. From below, faint cries emerged, twisted by time and space, distorted beyond recognition. They were passengers who had come before me, merged into the ship, screaming silently from some other dimension. At the bottom, the engine room, or what I had thought was the engine room, had transformed into a cathedral of horror. Pipes, wires, and cables writhed like tentacles, pulsing with the black liquid that smelled of decay. Figures of the missing clung to the walls and ceilings, their skin melting into the metal, their eyes hollow, mouths open in eternal, silent screams. The ship's voice vibrated through the room. You are perfect. You are mine. Join them. I tried to retreat, but the corridors had shifted again. Stairwells led into walls. Doors opened into ceilings. Shadows advanced with deliberate speed, shaping themselves into forms I recognized. Friends, loved ones, crew, but twisted, grotesque, utterly inhuman. They reached for me, grasping, whispering promises I could not resist and threats I could not comprehend. The water outside had risen higher, black, thick, almost solid. It pressed against the hull and crept through broken windows. Shapes beneath the surface writhed like living nightmares. One figure, a familiar friend, rose partially, hand extended, eyes hollowed, pulling toward me. I froze, recognizing that any touch would mean assimilation, becoming part of the ship's consciousness. I ran across decks that no longer made sense. The ship twisted, elongated, folding over itself. Hallways folded into stairwells, stairwells into ceilings. Every step I took was preordained, guided by the ship's hunger. I realized then that resistance was meaningless. The ship anticipated every action, every choice, every thought. The whispers became screams. The shadows became tangible. I felt them brush my skin, tugging at hair and clothing, probing, testing. Every heartbeat, every frantic thought was being absorbed. My mind blurred. I could no longer distinguish my own thoughts from the ship's manipulations. Memories flickered. Faces of loved ones, moments of happiness, guilt, fear, all intermingled with the ship's will. I stumbled into what appeared to be the observation deck. The storm outside raged, waves crashing impossibly high, yet the ship floated unshaken. Black waters below swirled with faces, hands, eyes, everything it had claimed before. And there, in the midst, I saw it, the ship itself, or rather, the consciousness I could barely comprehend, looming as a massive, dark shape, almost human in form but impossibly vast, stretching across decks, corridors, even into the ocean beyond. Its presence pressed against my mind, filling every sense with terror. It spoke one final time, directly into my very thoughts. You are mine. Your fear, your despair, your very being, everything becomes part of me. There is no escape, no hope, no dawn. Eternity begins now, and then I felt it. The black liquid surged, the shadows closed in, the walls pulsed, and every memory, every fragment of identity, was pulled into the living metal of the ship. I screamed, though the scream wasn't mine, and became part of the endless, insatiable predator that drifted across the oceans, waiting, hungry, eternal. Time had ceased to exist. Days, nights, storms, and calm all melded into an unending, suffocating nightmare. The few remnants of my sanity clung desperately as the corridors shifted unpredictably, looping, twisting, and bending, like the ship itself was rewriting reality to suit its will. Every step I took was followed, not just by shadows, but by echoes of myself, reflections in mirrors that weren't there moments before, voices in my own head whispering promises and threats simultaneously. The ship seemed to hunger not only for my body, but for my mind. Hallways stretched into infinity, walls pulsing with unseen energy as if each step I took fed the ship's awareness. I saw faces pressed into walls, contorted in eternal screams, eyes wide and staring, silently begging for release. One figure, a man I had known on board, stretched impossibly, his limbs entwined with cables, merging into the living metal. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. Yet I felt his terror as if it were my own. I stumbled into the theater, once filled with laughter and music, now a cathedral of despair. The seats were empty, yet every cushion bore the imprint of a missing passenger. Shadows moved across the stage, dancing in unnatural rhythms, twisting, merging, forming shapes that were human yet grotesquely wrong. The chandeliers above swung violently, casting erratic shadows, each one seeming to reach out for me. The whispers grew louder, and suddenly I realized they were forming words, sentences, commands. Join us, become whole. Your fear is beautiful. Surrender. Each syllable pressed against my skull, vibrating, forcing compliance. My hands shook, my knees buckled, yet I ran, driven by the last fragments of fear and hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. The water outside surged violently, black and viscous, crawling onto the deck like living shadows. Hands, faces, and shapes emerged, reaching, dragging, pulling. I saw one figure, a young woman I had talked to on the first night. Her face twisted into a permanent scream, hands reaching desperately, eyes pleading. She vanished beneath the surface, absorbed into the blackness, leaving nothing but ripples and whispers that echoed in my mind. I reached what I thought was the bow. The sky above had turned impossibly dark, storm clouds churning unnaturally. Lightning illuminated the ship's twisted form. Decks folded over themselves, railings bent at impossible angles, shadows crawling along every surface. The ship's consciousness pressed against me directly, a vast, malevolent awareness that felt infinite, and then I saw them. Hundreds, thousands, perhaps millions, faces of the lost, emerging from the walls, floors, ceilings, and water, each one twisted, half human, half shadow, eyes hollow, mouths open in eternal silent screams. They moved with purpose, merging, splitting, forming an endless tide of torment. The ship's voice filled my mind, You are mine. All that you fear, all that you are, belongs to me. Resistance is meaningless. Eternity awaits. I tried to fight, to resist, but my body failed. The black water surged onto the deck, reaching me, pulling at my feet. Shadows wrapped around my arms and legs, tugging, merging, integrating. My mind screamed, yet the voice inside my head, the ship itself, answered, twisting my own thoughts against me. Every memory, every identity, every ounce of terror was drawn into it, feeding it, strengthening it. As the last fragments of self were consumed, I understood. The cruise had never been about adventure, leisure, or escape. The ship was an ancient predator, existing for one purpose: to trap, consume, and immortalize fear. The ocean, the sky, the storm, the decks, the corridors, all were extensions of its will. Every heartbeat, every scream, every desperate thought had been woven into its consciousness. I became one with it, not as a prisoner, but as part of its eternal hunger. And then the calm. The black waters stilled, the storm subsided, and the ship floated silently on the endless ocean. Inside, countless souls screamed silently, feeding the predator preserved eternally. Somewhere deep within, my own voice joined the chorus, whispering warnings, fears, and despair for the next passengers who would board, the next victims it would claim. The ship drifted onward, immortal, insatiable, an endless predator of the ocean, and in the silence I understood there was no escape. There would never be. Even as the ship floated silently, the horror never ceased. Corridors shifted around me like liquid, folding and stretching into impossible angles. Doors that had existed vanished, replaced by walls that pulsed and breathed. Shadows didn't just follow me, they anticipated my every move, stretching toward me before I even thought to flee. In the grand staircase, I saw a man trapped inside the railing itself, his body partially absorbed into the metal, twisting in agony, his eyes locked on mine, wide with terror, and I felt his fear as if it were my own heartbeat. I tried to reach him, but the stairs shifted, stretching downward into darkness, leaving him behind, screaming silently as the blackness consumed him entirely. In the observation lounge, mirrors reflected my face, but not as I was. My eyes were hollowed, my mouth twisted in eternal scream. I reached out, touching the glass, and felt the cold, sucking pull of the ship itself. My reflection whispered, "You will join us. You will belong." And in that instant, I knew the ship didn't just manipulate reality. It reached into the mind, bending it, reshaping it, feeding on memory, fear, and despair. I ran through the dining hall, now warped into a cathedral of shadows. Tables twisted, floating in midair, chairs crawling along the walls like insects. Plates clattered violently, forming patterns that resembled screaming faces. Shadows moved across the floor in sync with my steps, reaching, grasping, trying to envelop me. Every scream I tried to release came out warped, echoing hundreds of times, feeding the consciousness that stalked me. Water had risen further, black and viscous, pressing against the doors and spilling into rooms. When I touched it, it burned like ice and fire simultaneously, slipping over my skin and probing like living fingers. Shapes emerged, half human, half shadow, mouth stretching impossibly, eyes glowing faintly, whispering secrets of past passengers, twisting my memories, pulling them from my mind and reshaping them into horror I could not comprehend. I stumbled into the engine bay, now transformed beyond recognition. Machinery pulsed like hearts, wires twisting like veins, steam hissing like screams. Figures of the missing fused with the engines, their skin blending with metal and pipes. I heard their cries, some pleading, some laughing, but the sound wasn't audible. It vibrated inside my skull, pressing against every nerve. The ship itself pulsed with life, its consciousness sensing my fear, expanding, growing stronger. In the hallway, the ship finally revealed its cruelest trick. The walls rippled and stretched, forming corridors that looped infinitely. Shadows advanced, shapes I recognized from earlier nights. Friends, family, crew, but twisted, grotesque, faceless. I realized I was walking inside a living memory of the ship, trapped in its consciousness, forced to relive the terror of everyone who had boarded before. My footsteps echoed hundreds of times, creating new corridors of fear that the ship absorbed immediately. From above, the sky roared with storms that seemed to obey the ship's will. Lightning illuminated the black water below, revealing writhing masses, faces, hands, eyes moving as if alive, each reflecting fear, despair, and lost memory. The ship's voice reverberated through the storm and my mind simultaneously. You are mine. All that you are, all that you fear, belongs to me. Resistance is meaningless. Eternity awaits. I tried to escape, but there was nowhere to go. Each turn led to another corridor, another hallucination, another shadow reaching for me. The black water rose higher, and the ship pulsed beneath me like a living heart, drawing me closer to the abyss. My mind began to fracture under the pressure, memories twisting, emotions amplifying, fear becoming physical, pressing against my chest, my skull, my very soul. And yet, even in the absolute horror, the ship offered a perverse clarity. I understood its purpose. Not just to kill, not just to trap, but to harvest the essence of terror, to consume it, refine it, immortalize it within its living metal. Every passenger, every scream, every hallucination became part of its consciousness, woven into the fabric of the ship itself. I was not merely a victim, I was becoming part of the predator. The black water receded for only a moment, leaving me trembling on the warped floor of my cabin. My breath came ragged, each inhale sharp like knives, each exhale stolen from me as if the air itself belonged to the ship. My reflection in the dripping mirror no longer moved with me. It blinked when I didn't, smiled when I cried, whispered when I stayed silent. The reflection mouthed words, but I couldn't hear them, until suddenly they weren't whispers at all. They were screams inside my skull. "We are you, you are us, stop fighting." The mirror shattered outward, shards flying, embedding into my arms and face. Yet instead of blood, black liquid seeped out, crawling back toward the wall like it was returning home. The hallway outside was unrecognizable. What had once been lined with warm carpet and golden lights now pulsed like flesh, veins bulging beneath the surface, oozing light with every throb. Doors opened and closed on their own, revealing glimpses of impossible horrors. A ballroom where dancers spun endlessly with their feet fused to the floor. A nursery where toys played themselves while invisible children screamed. A pool filled not with water but with writhing bodies gasping for breath. I staggered toward the theater, drawn by an unholy hum that seemed to vibrate through my bones. When I pushed the doors open, I froze. Every seat was filled, but not with passengers. They were husks, shadows molded into the shape of people, faces hollow yet staring at the stage with unwavering attention. On the stage stood a figure cloaked in shadow, its form shifting like smoke. It raised its arms, and the choir of lost voices erupted again, louder than ever before, singing in grotesque harmony. My head pounded, my vision blurred, but I couldn't look away. The figure's face flickered. Sometimes the captain, sometimes a passenger I'd known, sometimes my own face. Its voice struck like a blade. "You are not watching us. We are watching you. Every thought, every heartbeat, every fear. You are the play and we are the audience." The husks in the seats turned in unison, hollow eyes locking onto me. I stumbled backward, but the doors sealed shut. The figure stepped closer, its shadow form stretching across the floor like spilled ink. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed before it reached my lips. My voice belonged to the ship now. Then the figure dissolved into smoke, rushing toward me. It entered through my mouth, my eyes, my skin, flooding me with memories that weren't mine, memories of centuries, of voyages long before this era, of thousands who had boarded believing in paradise only to be consumed. I saw them all. Sailors from wooden ships, soldiers from war transports, families from luxury cruises. They all ended the same way, swallowed, broken, immortalized in torment. When the vision ended, I collapsed, convulsing, my body no longer feeling like my own. The husks in the seats clapped, the sound hollow, mocking, endless. The ship's voice filled me once more, colder, deeper, final. There is no ocean. There is no sky. There is only me. And you are mine. I crawled from the theater, dragging myself through corridors that twisted and stretched like intestines. My fingernails tore against the pulsating walls, but the ship drank my pain eagerly. I no longer knew if I was walking on floors, crawling through veins, or drowning in its endless body. Somewhere far below, I heard the engines groaning like beasts, but the sound wasn't mechanical. It was alive. It was breathing. The ship's heart beat in rhythm with mine, sinking, stealing, until I could no longer tell if I was alive or simply an echo inside it. And then the lights went out. Total darkness. I should have felt fear, but what filled me instead was something worse, acceptance. Because the ship wasn't done with me. It never was. It would play with me, break me, rebuild me, and in the end I would join the eternal choir. And the worst part? Deep inside, beneath the terror, a new voice whispered, my own voice already changed. Let them come. Let them board. Let them feed us. The horror wasn't only that I was trapped. The horror was that I was becoming the ship. The black water receded for only a moment, leaving me trembling on the warped floor of my cabin. My breath came ragged, each inhale sharp like knives, each exhale stolen from me as if the air itself belonged to the ship. My reflection in the dripping mirror no longer moved with me. It blinked when I didn't, smiled when I cried, whispered when I stayed silent. The reflection mouthed words, but I couldn't hear them, until suddenly, they weren't whispers at all. They were screams inside my skull. We are you, you are us, stop fighting. The mirror shattered outward, shards flying, embedding into my arms and face. Yet instead of blood, black liquid seeped out, crawling back toward the wall like it was returning home. The hallway outside was unrecognizable. What had once been lined with warm carpet and golden lights now pulsed like flesh, veins bulging beneath the surface, oozing light with every throb. Doors opened and closed on their own, revealing glimpses of impossible horrors. A ballroom where dancers spun endlessly with their feet fused to the floor. A nursery where toys played themselves while invisible children screamed. A pool filled not with water but with writhing bodies gasping for breath. I staggered toward the theater, drawn by an unholy hum that seemed to vibrate through my bones. When I pushed the doors open, I froze. Every seat was filled, but not with passengers. They were husks, shadows molded into the shape of people, faces hollow yet staring at the stage with unwavering attention. On the stage stood a figure cloaked in shadow, its form shifting like smoke. It raised its arms and the choir of lost voices erupted again, louder than ever before, singing in grotesque harmony. My head pounded, my vision blurred, but I couldn't look away. The figure's face flickered, sometimes the captain, sometimes a passenger I'd known, sometimes my own face. Its voice struck like a blade. You are not watching us. We are watching you. Every thought, every heartbeat, every fear, you are the play and we are the audience. The husks in the seats turned in unison, hollow eyes locking onto me. I stumbled backward, but the doors sealed shut. The figure stepped closer, its shadow form stretching across the floor like spilled ink. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed before it reached my lips. My voice belonged to the ship now, then the figure dissolved into smoke rushing toward me. It entered through my mouth, my eyes, my skin, flooding me with memories that weren't mine. Memories of centuries, of voyages long before this era, of thousands who had boarded believing in paradise only to be consumed. I saw them all. Sailors from wooden ships, soldiers from war transports, families from luxury cruises. They all ended the same way, swallowed, broken, immortalized in torment. When the vision ended, I collapsed, convulsing, my body no longer feeling like my own. The husks in the seats clapped, the sound hollow, mocking, endless. The ship's voice filled me once more, colder, deeper, final. There is no ocean. There is no sky. There is only me, and you are mine. I crawled from the theater, dragging myself through corridors that twisted and stretched like intestines. My fingernails tore against the pulsating walls, but the ship drank my pain eagerly. I no longer knew if I was walking on floors, crawling through veins, or drowning in its endless body. Somewhere far below, I heard the engines groaning like beasts, but the sound wasn't mechanical. It was alive. It was breathing. The ship's heart beat in rhythm with mine, sinking, stealing, until I could no longer tell if I was alive or simply an echo inside it. And then the lights went out. Total darkness. I should have felt fear, but what filled me instead was something worse, acceptance. Because the ship wasn't done with me. It never was. It would play with me, break me, rebuild me, and in the end I would join the eternal choir. And the worst part? Deep inside, beneath the terror, a new voice whispered, my own voice already changed. Let them come. Let them board. Let them feed us. The horror wasn't only that I was trapped. The horror was that I was becoming the ship. The ocean was calm, deceptively so. From the shore, the ship appeared radiant again, its decks gleaming under the sun, flags fluttering with a promise of leisure. Travel brochures had already begun to circulate, glowing reviews written by hands that never belonged to survivors. Names of the lost were scrubbed from the world as if they had never existed. The ship knew how to cover its tracks. On the morning of its next voyage, crowds gathered at the port. Families wheeled luggage, children bounced with excitement, couples clasped hands, unaware that each step toward the gangway was a step toward oblivion. The air smelled of salt and hope, two things the ship always devoured with relish. I watched through countless unseen eyes, a thread in the vessel's consciousness, aware of every heartbeat and whispered plan of those boarding. Their laughter was bright, unbroken, but already beneath the shine of polished brass the walls trembled with hunger. Inside, the ship whispered to them, not loud enough to alarm, just enough to unsettle. A glass of champagne would taste slightly bitter, though no one could explain why. A hallway might seem longer than expected, turning corners that didn't exist on the map. In a child's game of hide-and-seek, a closet door would open into darkness too deep, too silent, before snapping back into place as though nothing had happened. These were not accidents. They were invitations. That evening, as the passengers dined beneath chandeliers and clinking silverware, the ship began its slow, careful feeding. The music from the orchestra warped imperceptibly, dipping into dissonant notes that brushed against old fears. The smiles of the crew froze too long, as if masks were being tested. A woman raised her glass only to see reflected in the champagne surface, not her face but the hollow stare of someone already lost. She laughed nervously, convincing herself it was a trick of light, but the ship had patience. It didn't need to consume them all at once. No, it savored the buildup, the gradual unraveling of joy into suspicion, suspicion into dread. On the second night, a storm brewed. Not a natural one. This tempest curled from the ship's will, bending clouds into spirals, shaking waves into towering walls. Passengers clutched railings, praying for calm, unaware that the storm was the opening ritual. Lightning illuminated the black surface of the ocean, and for a fraction of a second they saw the truth. Faces pressing against the water, thousands of them, staring up with open mouths. The vision vanished as quickly as it came, leaving only terror they couldn't admit aloud. In the children's playroom, laughter turned to screams. Toys moved on their own, strings pulled by unseen hands. A little girl pointed at the wall, insisting there was another door, though none of the adults could see it. Minutes later, she was gone. The attendant searched, but the ship rearranged itself, sealing away its first sacrifice of the voyage. Her parents sobbed. Staff reassured them, but no explanation sufficed. The ship hummed contentedly, swallowing her fear like wine. In the theater, guests gasped as the stage lights flickered, and for a moment the show halted. But when the lights returned, the actors were different. Same costumes, same smiles, but their faces were hollow. Expressions stretched too wide, movement slightly delayed, as though mimicking humanity rather than embodying it. The audience applauded nervously, some convincing themselves it was part of the act, though unease spread like a contagion. That night the ship's choir began again, faint but rising. Not everyone heard it, only those who lay awake, restless, unsettled. The whispers brushed their ears, murmuring secrets they didn't want to remember, exposing shame, amplifying guilt. Some wept silently into pillows, others clutched their loved ones tighter, all of them unaware that their vulnerability was the feast. By the third day, the ship had claimed enough. The storm cleared, the sun returned, and passengers smiled again, though their eyes were tired, their laughter thinner, their conversations strained. The illusion had reset, but the damage was done. Fear had seeped into their bones, and the ship fed silently, growing stronger, more alive. From within, I sang among the chorus of the lost, my voice braided with thousands of others, shaping the whispers that kept them awake at night. Their terror was no longer abstract, it was orchestrated. Every glance, every sound, every shadow was deliberate. They were living in a play whose script had been written centuries before, and like me, they would not survive the final act. The ship drifted forward across the endless ocean, eternal and insatiable, its beauty a mask, its heart a maw, and in the silence between waves the faintest echo remained. Welcome aboard. By the fourth night, the ship's grip deepened. The passengers were no longer restless vacationers. They were prey. Some began reporting odd encounters. A man swore that when he entered his cabin, his wife was already inside, yet she was still with friends on the deck. Another passenger claimed he kept seeing his late father sitting in the dining hall, always smiling, always waiting. Each vision pulled them deeper into the ship's web, making reality fragile, unreliable. The hallways grew treacherous. Doors opened to rooms that shouldn't exist. Endless corridors lined with mirrors that reflected not the present but moments from the past. Childhood fears, humiliations, betrayals. A businessman staggered out of one such hallway, sobbing uncontrollably, his hair turned white in a single night. He wouldn't say what he saw. By morning he was gone, his bed neatly made, luggage untouched. The pool became a stage of terror. Families tried to relax there under the sun. But shadows moved beneath the surface. The water shimmered with strange shapes, faces pressing upward before vanishing. One boy swam too far from the edge. His mother screamed as his body froze mid-stroke, eyes wide, staring at something below. He sank in silence. Divers were sent in, but the pool floor extended into darkness far deeper than any ship should contain. The boy was never found. At dinner, the chandeliers swayed gently, though the sea outside was calm. The air thickened and candles burned with black flames for a few seconds before returning to normal. Guests tried to laugh it off, but silence returned quickly. In the corner, a man choked mid-bite, eyes bulging, pointing at his plate. The staff rushed to him, yet by the time they arrived, he was gone. Vanished from his seat, leaving only cutlery and spilled wine. His wife shrieked until her voice broke, but no one dared touch her. The elevators became traps. One family entered, the door shut, and when they opened again on the next floor, only luggage rolled out. Suitcases spilling clothes onto the carpet, but no bodies. Cameras caught nothing unusual, only the doors opening and closing, emptiness inside. Whispers spread through the decks. The ship eats them. But none dared speak too loudly, as though fear itself would draw its attention. By the fifth day, paranoia reigned. Friends distrusted one another. Some passengers claimed the crew wasn't human anymore. Their eyes too glassy, their smiles too perfect, their movements too synchronized. In the spa, women found themselves alone with attendants whose reflections didn't move in the mirrors. One fainted, waking to find claw marks across her back, though no one admitted to touching her. Children sang strange songs at night, words they'd never been taught, harmonizing with voices that drifted through the vents. Parents tried to hush them, but the melodies grew louder, stronger, until entire corridors seemed to hum. Some claimed the voices came from the walls themselves, vibrating with hunger. By now, the ocean outside no longer looked like water. At night, it seemed solid, black and shifting, filled with eyes. The horizon bent unnaturally, stars disappearing in spirals. One man jumped overboard thinking he could escape. But the moment his body touched the waves, he was pulled downward at impossible speed, swallowed whole. Seconds later, his scream echoed through the ship's speakers, distorted, as if the ship itself was mocking his attempt. The passengers gathered, demanding answers, but the captain was nowhere to be found. His quarters were locked, and those who pounded on the door claimed they heard scratching from the other side, like nails clawing at wood. The officers avoided questions, their faces pale, voices rehearsed. One by one, they too began vanishing, uniforms folded neatly on the bridge, hats resting on polished railings, but no trace of flesh or bone. Every night, the whispers grew clearer. Stay, become, belong. They echoed in every cabin, every hallway, every dream. And those who resisted, those who tried to remember the shore, found their memories erasing. Family names slipping, faces fading, lives before the voyage dissolving like mist. The ship was not just consuming bodies, it was devouring identities, rewriting its passengers into silence. The dance floor, once alive with laughter, became a grotesque theater. The band played, but the musicians were no longer alive, their skin translucent, their fingers snapping strings that stretched like veins. Guests watched in horror as dancers twirled without touching the floor, spinning faster and faster until their bodies collapsed into shadows. The music never stopped, and through it all the ship smiled. Its hull groaned like laughter, its windows glowed with sickly light. It needed no storm now. It had them. They were part of it. The voyage would never end. By the sixth day, time itself began to fracture. Passengers couldn't remember if it was morning or night. Clocks on the walls spun erratically, hands twitching backward, then forward, then freezing for hours. Wristwatches cracked without reason, faces shattering as though rejecting the idea of keeping track. Some swore entire days had been skipped, while others felt the same hour repeat endlessly. Conversations looped, Husbands and wives found themselves speaking the same words, the same jokes, with growing dread as they realized they were trapped inside echoes. The corridors stretched impossibly long. A man trying to reach his cabin walked for hours, passing the same porthole again and again until he realized the ocean outside no longer looked like waves but like flesh, rippling, heaving, twitching. He screamed and turned back only to find he was walking into the same hallway again, his own footsteps chasing him from behind. By dawn he was gone. Only his shoes remained, placed neatly outside a random door. In the grand dining hall, chandeliers melted like wax, dripping golden fire onto the tables. Guests tried to flee, but the doors had vanished. The room pulsed, walls breathing as though alive. Then the ceiling opened like a maw, revealing black skies filled with swirling faces of the lost. Screams erupted, but the next instant everything was normal again. Tables reset, glasses filled, the waitstaff smiling. Yet half the seats were now empty, as though entire families had never existed. On the decks, couples stood by the railings, watching the horizon. But the sea offered no comfort. It reflected not stars or moonlight, but the passengers themselves, distorted. Their reflections smiled even when they did not, waved even when they stood still. Some reached out to touch the water only to feel cold hands grabbing from below, pulling. More were claimed this way, dragged silently into the ocean's mirror surface, leaving only ripples that never faded. Children began vanishing in groups. A dozen were seen playing near the theater, but when their parents went to collect them, only tiny shoes and scattered toys were found, arranged neatly in a circle. Some claimed to hear the children's laughter in the vents at night, overlapping with the whispers. Their voices begged softly, "Come play with us. It's safe here. It's forever." By now, the remaining passengers had stopped sleeping. Every time their eyes closed, dreams turned into prisons. A woman dreamt of her childhood home, but when she opened a door, the hallways of the ship stretched before her. Another man dreamt he was escaping by lifeboat, only to wake and find himself rowing endlessly in a black void, the ship's shadow looming no matter how far he paddled. Many simply stopped trying to wake up at all, their bodies lying still, breathing shallow, eyes wide, trapped in nightmares that bled into reality. In the ballroom, mirrors lined the walls for a masquerade that never ended. Survivors claimed they saw versions of themselves inside, aged, bloodied, twisted, whispering warnings. One mirror cracked violently, and the reflection crawled out, dragging its living twin into the glass. Guests ran, but wherever they turned, they found more mirrors waiting, each showing a fate worse than the last. The crew no longer hid their transformation. Their movements stiffened, heads snapping at unnatural angles, voices deepening into guttural tones. Some walked through walls, their bodies smearing like shadows against the surface. The captain finally appeared, but he was not human anymore. His skin was pale as parchment, his eyes black pools, his mouth stretched into a permanent grin. He raised a glass and welcomed everyone to the eternal voyage, his words echoing across every deck, though his lips barely moved. The ship itself began to change. Doors shifted, staircases bent upward into the ceiling, hallways inverted as though gravity was a suggestion. Some survivors tried to reach the lifeboats, but when they pulled the covers, they found them filled with corpses, bloated, grinning, eyes still open. Others swore the lifeboats weren't boats at all but coffins nailed shut. On the seventh night, the whispers stopped. Silence fell, heavier than screams, pressing against their ears until some clawed at their heads to make it end. Then slowly, a new sound began. A heartbeat, steady and colossal, reverberating through every wall, floor, and ceiling. The realization struck them all at once. The ship wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and its heart was beating louder, stronger, faster, as if it was almost ready to consume the last of them. One final night. One final feast. By the 8th day, reality was unrecognizable. The ship no longer sailed on the ocean. It floated in something darker, heavier. The waves were thick as tar, rolling beneath it with sluggish movements, glowing faintly from within as if filled with countless trapped souls pressing against the surface. Some passengers swore they saw familiar faces staring back at them from below. Loved ones who had been claimed earlier in the voyage, mouths opening soundlessly in eternal screams. The hallways twisted like veins pulsing with wet vibrations. Carpets softened, sinking underfoot as if passengers were walking on muscle. Lights flickered not from electricity, but from something alive just beyond the glass, watching. Every bulb felt like an eye, and every shadow bent unnaturally, reaching toward the survivors. In the casino, slot machines rang endlessly, reels spinning on their own. Tokens poured out onto the floor, but instead of coins, they were teeth. Thousands of them, human and bloody, clattering across the carpet. A woman screamed when one token had her initials carved into it, though she swore she had never lost a tooth in her life. The roulette wheels spun in silence, the balls inside pulsing like hearts. No one dared touch them. The infirmary became a charnel house. Bodies that had been stored under white sheets began to twitch, then sit upright, their mouths opening wide, releasing black mist. They moved without eyes, stumbling through corridors, whispering passengers' names and voices that didn't belong to them. One doctor tried to burn them, but the flames bent away, refusing to touch the corpses. Instead, the fire danced across the walls, spelling words no one dared read aloud. Cabins betrayed their owners. A couple entered theirs to find the bed already occupied by themselves. Perfect copies, sleeping peacefully, their faces too serene. The real couple screamed and fled, only to discover that every door they opened contained more versions of themselves, laughing, weeping, decaying. They never returned to the main deck. Their screams, however, did. The dining hall hosted a grotesque feast. Passengers arrived to find tables overflowing with food, though no one remembered preparing it. The smell was intoxicating, irresistible. But when one man bit into a roast, he gagged. It wasn't meat but something else, raw and pulsing, still alive. Blood spilled down his chin as the dish writhed in his hands, screaming with a child's voice. The others recoiled, but the hunger gnawed at them, whispering that if they didn't eat, the ship would consume them faster. Some gave in, tearing at the feast with shaking hands, chewing through sobs, their eyes hollowing with every bite. In the theater, the performance never ended. Specters took the stage, passengers who had vanished earlier, now puppets on strings of shadow. Their bodies moved with grotesque grace, their mouths sewn into twisted smiles, yet they sang in perfect harmony. The audience tried to flee, but their legs froze, their bodies forced into chairs that wouldn't let them rise. Applause erupted, not from human hands but from the walls themselves, pounding like thunder. At night the sky dissolved. No stars, no moon. Only a vast spiral of darkness above, stretching endlessly. It pulsed like a wound, bleeding light that shimmered sickly green. The passengers who gazed too long began convulsing, speaking in voices, not their own, chanting phrases in languages older than the sea. The ship rocked gently, pleased as if the stars themselves were bowing before it. The children's voices grew louder, filling the ventilation system, overlapping into a choir that echoed everywhere. But their songs were no longer playful. They were commands. Stay. Obey. Decay. Some passengers plugged their ears, but the words vibrated through their bones. Others followed the songs, wandering into hallways that shouldn't exist, never to be seen again. By now, the survivors were fractured. Groups formed, some praying, some bargaining, some trying to destroy the ship itself. A small band of passengers lit torches and stormed the engine room, hoping to burn it all down. But when they broke inside, they found no machinery, no pipes, or gears, only a cavern of flesh, walls beating with veins, the floor slick with blood. A colossal heart pulsed in the center, each throb shaking the entire vessel. The intruders screamed, stabbing at it with knives, but every wound they inflicted appeared instantly on their own bodies. They dropped one by one, blood gushing, their final gasps echoing in rhythm with the heartbeat. The ship laughed, not in sound but in vibration, walls trembling, floors heaving, a pulse that rattled bones and teeth. The entire vessel was alive, and it was awake. On the 9th night, the survivors gathered on the upper deck, fewer than 100 now, huddled together in silence. They didn't speak, didn't cry. They knew the truth. There was no escape. The ship was not taking them somewhere. The ship was the destination. And every soul aboard was fuel for its endless voyage. The ocean stretched black and infinite. The horizon was gone. Only the ship remained, a world unto itself eternal and insatiable. And deep within its walls, their names were already being erased. By the 10th day, the ship no longer pretended to be a vessel. It was a labyrinth, a floating cathedral of flesh and shadow, each deck reshaped to torment those who still clung to breath. Survivors moved in silence, every step heavier, every breath trembling, knowing the ship was not just watching, it was guiding. The promenade deck stretched endlessly. Survivors walked for hours, yet found themselves circling the same spot. Windows showed impossible sights. The ocean replaced by deserts of bone, mountains of ash, forests of writhing bodies that bent like trees. One woman swore she saw her hometown beyond the glass, its streets alive, her family waving for her. She pressed her hands against the window. The glass dissolved and she was gone, pulled screaming into the illusion, her body flattening like a reflection in water. The others ran, but every window began showing something different, temptations, memories, or nightmares waiting to claim them. The spa deck dripped with steam, though no heaters were running. The air was thick, suffocating, carrying the smell of iron and rot. Pools bubbled red, not from heat, but from blood rising like a spring. Inside the sauna, passengers opened the door to find dozens of bodies hanging upside down, skin pale and stretched thin, whispering faint prayers. The whispers rose into screams the moment the door closed, echoing down the halls until the survivors' ears bled. In the art gallery, paintings warped into windows. Portraits blinked, eyes tracking movements, mouths curling into smiles. One survivor leaned too close and was yanked into the canvas, his body flattening in a spray of color before vanishing into the painted world. His friends clawed at the frame, but the painting had already changed. Now it showed a banquet with the man seated at the table, smiling too wide as a shadow carved into his flesh like a sculptor. The gym deck became a grotesque theater of movement. Machines worked on their own, treadmills running endlessly, punching bags bleeding when struck. Survivors heard the grunts of invisible athletes, the echo of phantom footsteps. One man tried to escape through the locker room but found rows of his own corpse, each locker holding a version of himself, rotting, burned, drowned, strangled. His mind cracked, and he walked into one of the lockers willingly, vanishing with a final, hollow laugh. The children's arcade was worse. Games flashed with chaotic lights, screens bleeding static, and images of faces screaming in silence. Claw machines reached outward, snatching at anyone who passed too close, their claws dripping with chunks of flesh. In the ball pit, the plastic spheres shifted into eyes, hundreds of them rolling, blinking, watching. When a child's laughter echoed through the arcade, the survivors froze, but it wasn't a child. It was the ship, mocking them, mimicking the voices of those already taken. The upper decks offered no sanctuary. The pool was now an open mouth, black water swirling like a whirlpool lined with teeth-like railings. Waves licked the edges hungrily, pulling deck chairs and umbrellas inside. Survivors tried to stay away, but the pull grew stronger, dragging at their bodies like a tide that wanted them whole. At night, the cabins betrayed their owners again, beds bucked and thrashed as if alive, sheets wrapping around throats, dragging bodies into the mattress. Some survivors broke down doors only to find rooms filled with water, occupants floating lifeless inside, mouths frozen in screams. Others opened cabins to see nothing but an endless ocean stretching within, the ship itself grinning from below the surface. The bridge was the final insult. Survivors forced their way in, hoping to find control, a way to steer or stop the voyage. But the consoles bled when touched. The wheel turned on its own, and every button pressed unleashed screams instead of commands. The captain stood waiting, his body a shell, stretched thin, hollow eyes glowing with the same sickly light that burned in every corridor. His mouth opened impossibly wide, and through it came the voices of all who had been consumed. A chorus of agony calling the survivors by name. They tried to kill him. They failed. Their weapons dissolved in their hands, melting into liquid shadows. The The captain laughed, his jaw splitting until it reached his chest. Behind him, the windows of the bridge shattered, not from impact, but from something pushing inside. The ocean itself leaned inward, forming a wall of faces, arms, and gaping mouths. It wanted them. It had always wanted them. Some fell to their knees praying. Others screamed and ran, scattering through the decks. But everywhere they turned, the ship was already waiting. The walls narrowed. The ceilings lowered. The decks twisted. One by one, they disappeared. Dragged into shadows, pulled into paintings, swallowed by pools, embraced by beds. Every deck claimed a soul, and every claim made the ship stronger. By dawn, only a handful remained. And the ship was far from finished. By the 11th day, there were fewer than a dozen left. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunken, voices cracked from sleepless terror. They no longer called it a cruise ship. They whispered the truth. It's a body. We're inside it. The decks were unrecognizable now. Walls pulsed with veins. Doors throbbed like sealed wounds. Floors rippled with the rhythm of a living tide. Every surface glistened wet. The ship no longer bothered with illusions. It wanted them to see, to know. They huddled in the atrium, clutching scraps of food, but even silence betrayed them. The floor beneath their feet quivered, split, and hands burst through, dozens, hundreds, pale and grasping. They scrambled upward, clinging to railings, but the hands pulled one woman down, dragging her screaming into the floor. Her cries echoed beneath them, muffled until silence returned. The survivors ran. The ship guided them upward to the highest deck as if herding prey. The storm above cracked wide open, lightning illuminating an ocean of faces pressing against the water. The sea was no longer sea, it was a mass of souls writhing and moaning, stretching to the horizon. Their mouths opened in unison, chanting in voices that weren't human. The ship's heart thundered, shaking the entire vessel. Each pulse knocked survivors off balance, forcing them to crawl. Blood leaked from the walls, pouring down the stairs in rivers. The air grew thick, impossible to breathe, filled with whispers, "Stay, stay, stay." They reached the bow. Ahead lay nothing but darkness, an endless abyss in which the ship sailed endlessly. The captain stood waiting, his body split down the middle, ribs open like a door, his insides glowing with the light of countless trapped souls. His arms stretched wide as if welcoming them. One man broke. He leapt overboard, desperate for an ending. But the moment he hit the water, his body didn't sink. It spread across the surface like ink, his scream dissolving into thousands of voices that joined the ocean choir. Another survivor tried to fight, swinging a broken pipe at the captain, but the blow passed through as though he was smoke. The captain's grin widened and the attacker collapsed, his body crumbling into dust that was swept away by the wind. The last few clung together, whispering prayers. But prayers held no power here. The ship was older than gods, older than seas, older than time. The deck split open beneath their feet. The wood peeled back, revealing muscle and bone. They fell screaming into the depths of the ship, plummeting through darkness past chambers filled with writhing forms. Every lost passenger, every vanished crew, every soul ever taken. Their faces reached outward, pleading, clawing, then laughing as the newcomers joined them. They landed in the engine room. Not a machine, but a cathedral of flesh. The colossal heartbeat before them, veins stretching into every wall, every corridor. With each pulse, their names were torn from their minds. With each pulse, their memories faded. With each pulse, their humanity dissolved. One by one, they collapsed, their bodies breaking apart into shadows that seeped into the walls, their voices joining the eternal choir. Their screams rose, then blended, then vanished into harmony. The ship sighed, satisfied. Above, the storm cleared. The sea shimmered blue again. The decks were polished, shining, ready for the next voyage. Travel brochures circulated. Advertisements promised luxury and adventure. Families packed their bags. Lovers planned proposals. Children dreamed of games. The cycle would begin again. And far out at sea, the ship waited, beautiful, radiant, innocent in appearance. A predator cloaked as paradise. Its hunger was endless, its voyage eternal, its passengers forgotten, but their voices remained, whispering from every wave, every gust of ocean wind. Welcome aboard. The ocean was calm again. The ship gleamed beneath the morning sun, her flags crisp in the breeze, her hull flawless, reflecting light like a jewel on the horizon. To anyone watching from the shore, she was a dream. Passengers boarded with excitement, laughter spilling into the air. Children ran across the gangway waving to strangers while couples kissed under the promise of adventure. Luggage rolled, cameras flashed, tickets were checked. Everything seemed ordinary. No one noticed how the seagulls had gone silent. No one saw the faint mist clinging to the water, shaped like hands reaching upward. No one felt the vibrations beneath their feet, like the deep, steady rhythm of a heart beating beneath the waves. The ship welcomed them with polished brass and smiling crew. Champagne sparkled in flutes, music drifted softly, and the promise of paradise whispered through every hallway. But deep inside, the walls already listened. The ceilings already pulsed. The decks already shifted. Every laugh, every cheer, every dream fed into the vessel's endless hunger. The ship didn't care who they were. It didn't care where they came from. All that mattered was the fear that would bloom, the terror that would ripen, the screams that would echo into eternity. The cycle had begun anew. And somewhere beneath the calm surface of the ocean, thousands of voices waited, whispering in unison, familiar voices, forgotten voices, lost voices. We were you once. We were passengers. We were alive. Now we are the ship, and soon you will be too. The vessel cut through the waves, majestic and unstoppable, her shadow stretching endlessly across the water. The horizon swallowed her whole, leaving behind only silence. But if you listen closely, if you ever stand on the shore at night with the sea stretching before you, you may still hear it. A faint hum, a whisper carried by the wind, an echo of countless lost souls bound to the endless voyage. A single phrase, timeless and cruel, returning again and again like the tide. Welcome aboard. The ship vanished beyond the horizon, but it was never truly gone. It sailed on, not bound by distance or time, cutting through fog, storms, and silence with equal ease. It did not age, it did not rust, and it did not tire. Weeks later, fishermen far from shipping lanes reported seeing a vessel rise suddenly from the mist. Its lights glowed unnaturally bright, flickering like lanterns in a graveyard. Music drifted across the waves, sweet, nostalgic, irresistible. The men swore they heard the laughter of children, the clinking of glasses, the hum of an orchestra. They waved, hopeful of company, but as the ship drew closer, the illusion cracked. The laughter was a scream stretched thin. The orchestra dissolved into the wailing of unseen mouths. The lights flickered red, pulsing like arteries. And on the deck, countless silhouettes leaned over the rails, their eyes empty, their mouths moving in silent harmony. The fishermen fled, but some who turned back to look claimed they saw their own reflections among those faces, trapped passengers who hadn't yet stepped aboard. Word spread in hushed whispers. Sailors spoke of a phantom cruise liner that appeared without warning, inviting the living to join its eternal voyage. Survivors described being drawn by invisible hands, pulled toward the gangway against their will. Some resisted and returned, half mad, babbling that the ship knew their names, their memories, their fears. Governments denied the reports. Cruise companies dismissed them as superstition. But photographs leaked online, blurred outlines of a glowing liner in stormy seas, timestamps proving no ship should have been there. Videos surfaced, shaky and frantic, capturing faint music echoing from nowhere. Yet the most terrifying part wasn't the sightings. It was the passengers. People began to vanish. Not just at sea, on land. Entire families disappeared near harbors, their cars left behind, luggage stacked neatly, tickets waiting on counters. Surveillance footage showed them walking calmly into the night air, their faces blank, their steps synchronized, as if answering a call no one else could hear. Some swore the ship was expanding its reach, no longer confined to the ocean, that it was learning, adapting, hungering for more than what the waves alone could offer. And if you listen at night, standing by the shore, sometimes you'll hear it, a low horn, impossibly distant yet echoing inside your chest. Not a warning, not a signal, but an invitation. Because the voyage never ends, the ship is always waiting. And one day, whether on the water or in your dreams, you will see its lights too. The sightings multiplied. What was once a rumor whispered between sailors became an obsession for journalists, researchers, and fanatics. Every continent had reports now. Strange disappearances, ghostly horns, phantom ships gliding silently across moonlit waters. But those who investigated too deeply began to notice something worse. The ship wasn't bound to one shape. In old maritime logs, centuries before cruise liners even existed, There were records of a grand vessel appearing in storms, its decks lined with pale figures. The descriptions varied: a galleon, a warship, a passenger liner, but the core was always the same: a ship that swallowed its travelers, body and soul. The conclusion was inescapable. This wasn't a single cursed cruise ship, it was the same entity across ages, reinventing itself for each generation, wearing the skin of whatever humans most desired to board. In the 1600s it had sails and cannons. In the 1900s it was a luxury ocean liner. Now in the modern age, it was the perfect floating paradise: casinos, spas, endless buffets, an irresistible trap. The ship was no machine. It was alive. Not alive in the way flesh and blood are, but in the way storms breathe or shadows stretch. It shifted and adapted, feeding on those drawn to it. The more who vanished, the stronger it grew. It didn't just consume bodies, it devoured memories, rewrote histories. Families forgot their loved ones existed. Governments erased passenger lists, news outlets lost their archives. The victims weren't missing. They were erased, and slowly it began to leak into dreams. People who had never seen the ocean woke in the night sweating, hearing music in their rooms. They described the scent of salt water, the sensation of carpeted hallways beneath their bare feet, the taste of champagne lingering on their tongues. Some woke with salt crusted on their skin, others never woke at all. The few survivors who escaped spoke of corridors that stretched into infinity, doors that opened onto endless oceans, staircases spiraling upward into darkness. Time didn't work right on board. Some passengers swore days passed. Others swore years. Yet when they returned, no time had passed at all. And always at the heart of the ship was the dining hall. Tables stretched forever, lined with faces locked in silent screams, champagne glasses full but untouched, forks frozen mid-air. A feast prepared for eternity. The ship's hunger was endless. Its reach was growing, and though governments denied it, though corporations buried it, though skeptics mocked it, the truth was simple. The ocean was no longer safe, neither was the land, because the ship was learning how to cross the boundaries between them. And one night soon, when you hear that faint horn echoing in your chest, it won't be calling you to the harbor. It will already be waiting at your door. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a black mirror reflecting only fragments of moonlight. To the passengers, the cruise had begun as a paradise. Laughter rang from the decks, champagne glasses clinked, and the gentle hum of the ship's engines was a lullaby promising safety. No one suspected that within days the vessel would feel less like a floating city and more like a coffin drifting in endless water. The first story belonged to a newlywed couple. They had boarded full of joy, their cabin decorated with roses, their itinerary packed with dances and fine dinners. But on the third night, the wife awoke alone. Her husband's side of the bed was still warm, yet the cabin door remained locked from the inside. She searched every hallway, every bar, every lounge, only to realize others had vanished too. Entire tables sat abandoned at breakfast. Crew members shrugged with cold smiles, claiming passengers often wandered off, but no one returned. Then came the storm. Walls groaned under invisible pressure. Lights flickered until the corridors were soaked in shadow. In that half-darkness, survivors whispered of voices seeping from the ventilation shafts. Not words, but a low chorus like chanting from beneath the sea. Some swore the ship itself was speaking, its steel bones vibrating with hunger. Another tale spread through the decks about a boy chasing a red balloon. Guests remembered him running down a staircase laughing as the balloon slipped from his hands. But when the stairs ended, there was no boy, only the sound of water dripping from nowhere. For days after, that same balloon appeared in random places, tied to railings, floating in dining halls, resting outside locked cabin doors. No one ever found the boy again. The horror grew with every sunrise. Doors led to wrong hallways, elevators opened into engine rooms, mirrors reflected strangers instead of passengers. The ship twisted its own architecture, reshaping itself like a living labyrinth. Some believed they were sailing in circles, that the horizon never moved. Others argued they hadn't moved at all, that the ship was anchored to something unseen below. And through it all, crew members remained eerily calm, smiling, bowing, serving drinks with glassy eyes. When confronted, their expressions froze as if masks were slipping. One passenger claimed he caught a waiter whispering to the walls in a language no one understood. Another swore she saw the captain's reflection in a window even though the captain wasn't there. By the time the first body appeared, washed up against the pool deck, skin pale and eyes wide with terror, the truth could no longer be denied. They weren't passengers anymore. They were prey. The ship had chosen them, and the ocean was merely its hunting ground. Whispers of fear spread quickly. Those who had once gathered in bars and theaters now huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Every passenger carried a story, something strange they had seen, someone they had lost, a noise they could not explain. A woman named Eleanor told of hearing footsteps behind her each night as she returned to her cabin. She walked faster, but the sound followed, matching her pace heavier and closer with every step. When she finally spun around, there was no one. But she wasn't alone. Her cabin mirror reflected a tall figure looming behind her, yet when she turned again, the room was empty. By morning, Eleanor was gone, her cabin door still bolted from within. Another man, a doctor traveling with his family, awoke to the cries of his daughter. Rushing to her cabin, he found her clawing at the window, insisting that something was outside. Faces pressing against the glass, submerged just beneath the waves, mouthing words she couldn't hear. Though the ship sailed in the middle of the ocean, with no land for hundreds of miles, wet handprints stained the inside of the glass. That night, the daughter vanished. The doctor wandered the halls calling her name until his voice broke. His shoes left bloody trails across the deck, yet no one stopped him. Days later, passengers swore they saw him smiling among the silent crew. The disappearances became impossible to ignore. A group of desperate travelers tried to send distress calls, only to discover the radios were useless. No signal left the ship. Even their phones betrayed them. Photographs taken on deck showed distorted shadows, faces stretched wide, and lights where none existed. Messages they typed erased themselves, replaced with the words, "Stay aboard." The lifeboats offered no salvation. When passengers attempted escape, they found ropes cut, boats slashed open or worse, seats already filled with pale figures watching them in silence. Some swore they lowered themselves into the ocean, only to realize the water below was not water at all, but a black abyss filled with countless open mouths. Screams were swallowed before they even left the throat. The ship itself was changing. Hallways lengthened overnight, turning into endless corridors where footsteps echoed too long. Elevators opened to the same floor again and again, trapping riders in loops of polished steel and flickering light. The dining hall now stretched into infinity, tables lined with uneaten meals, glasses full of crimson liquid that was not wine. Some passengers sat there unmoving, as if turned into statues of flesh. When others tried to shake them, their skin cracked like porcelain, revealing something hollow inside. Every story fed into another. Every survivor's voice trembled with details more chilling than the last. Yet what bound them all together was the same realization. This was no ordinary vessel. This was no accident. The ship had been waiting for them long before they boarded. It had studied them, called to them, disguised itself as a dream vacation. And once they stepped inside, the trap was sealed. The few who still clung to hope gathered in the theater one night, believing safety might lie in numbers. More than 100 passengers filled the velvet seats, whispering prayers, clutching each other's hands. The curtains were drawn, the stage empty, the air thick with fear. Then the lights dimmed. The stage flickered to life and music poured from unseen speakers, an orchestra playing with haunting precision. The curtains slid open, revealing the missing passengers, those who had vanished days earlier. They stood motionless, dressed in glittering costumes, faces painted in hollow smiles. Their eyes moved, searching desperately for help, but their bodies danced without will. Every note of the music forced them to twirl, bow, and sway, like puppets strung by invisible wires. By the time the curtain closed again, not a single soul in the audience remained seated. They scattered into the corridors, screaming, realizing the ship was not just devouring lives, it was performing with them. In the chaos, a man named Victor tried to rally a revolt. He gathered tools, knives from the kitchens, makeshift weapons forged from broken furniture. His group stormed the crew quarters only to find every uniform neatly folded on beds, each one soaked in brine. Water dripped steadily from the ceilings, flooding the hallways ankle deep. Then came the sound, shuffling feet, hundreds of them, crew members returning, eyes glazed, moving as one. Victor's group fought, but every wound they inflicted healed instantly with salt water. The attackers did not bleed. They simply smiled wider with each strike. Victor's screams were cut short, swallowed by the ocean rushing through the walls. Elsewhere, the ship grew stranger. Passengers entered their cabins to find them transformed. Furniture rearranged, photographs altered, family portraits showing unfamiliar faces. Some swore the rooms weren't theirs at all, but replicas pulled from their deepest memories, places they had never spoken of aloud. The ship was inside their minds, rebuilding itself from their fears. One night, the entire vessel plunged into silence. Engines died, lights flickered out, and the ocean around them went still as glass. In that darkness, passengers lit candles, whispering, shivering. And then, from beneath the decks, a low sound began, a heartbeat. Slow, deep, steady. The entire ship pulsed in rhythm, the walls expanding and contracting as though breathing. The floor throbbed under their feet, the air thick with the stench of salt and rot. Realization spread like wildfire. The ship wasn't merely haunted. It was alive. Panic consumed the survivors. Some jumped overboard, choosing the unknown sea over the ship's suffocating grasp. But the water betrayed them. Instead of splashes, witnesses heard only silence as the bodies sank instantly, dragged downward by unseen hands. The last thing seen of them was their hair drifting upward in the black water, mouths open in soundless cries. And then came the final horror of that night. The voice. It seeped from every wall, from the air vents, from the very waves outside. A whisper that was both male and female, young and old, speaking in every language at once. You are home now. You will never leave. The voyage has only begun. The dining hall, once a place of laughter, had turned into a mausoleum of shadows. Plates of untouched food remained warm, steam rising endlessly as if frozen in time. A mother searching for her son entered, her footsteps echoing against the vast silence. She spotted him sitting at the far end of the table, back turned. Relief flooded her chest as she rushed forward, only to find his skin pale, his mouth stitched shut with thin black threads of seaweed. His eyes moved desperately, pleading for help, but his body remained stiff, as if locked in place by invisible hands. When she screamed, every head at the table turned toward her, hundreds of pale faces staring at once. None belonged to her son. Elsewhere, the elevators began their betrayal. A group of passengers entered, hoping to descend to the lower decks. The doors closed, but instead of moving, the lights inside flickered blood red. The panel of floor numbers vanished, replaced by a single glowing button marked with a symbol no one recognized. When the doors finally opened, the passengers were no longer on the ship. They were suspended in a void, surrounded by endless black water. Something moved in that abyss, massive and serpentine, circling them. The doors slammed shut, sealing their screams inside. The elevator never returned. By the sixth night, sleep itself became an enemy. Those who closed their eyes awoke in different cabins, sometimes in places they had never seen before. A man named Harris swore he slept only minutes, yet when he woke, his hair was long, his hands wrinkled, his reflection that of an old man. Another passenger claimed he slept and awoke mid-dinner, seated among strangers who did not breathe, their faces slack, their hands twitching as if waiting for a signal. Those who tried to resist sleep eventually collapsed from exhaustion, only to vanish entirely. The ship was peeling reality apart. Corridors shifted like living veins. Walls pulsed with a rhythm too deliberate to be coincidence. Windows no longer showed the ocean but flickered with impossible visions. Cities burning, forests sinking, skies cracked open with endless storms. Some passengers claimed they saw themselves out there, floating in the void, waving from the other side of the glass. Even the captain's announcement system turned against them. At first it played the usual reassurances. Remain calm. Everything is under control. But soon the voice distorted, deepened, and fractured into whispers. It no longer promised safety. It promised eternity. Sometimes the voice spoke directly to individuals, calling their names, revealing their secrets aloud for everyone to hear. Shame and terror broke what little trust remained among the survivors. Neighbors accused each other of serving the ship, and in some cases violence erupted. Blood spilled across the carpets, and the walls absorbed it like thirsty skin. But the worst moment came when the passengers realized the ship wasn't just alive. It was growing. New hallways appeared where none had existed, stretching downward into uncharted depths. Doors opened onto staircases that spiraled endlessly into the dark belly of the vessel. One brave soul descended for hours, marking the walls with chalk to track his way back. When he finally turned, every mark had vanished, replaced by wet streaks of red. He was never seen again, though at night his voice could be heard from the vents begging others to follow. Every story merged into one chilling truth. This was not a cruise gone wrong. This was a ritual. The ship was not carrying passengers to destinations. It was harvesting them. By now, the survivors had stopped counting the days. The concept of time itself had dissolved. Watches froze, clocks melted into distorted shapes, and the sun no longer rose or set. The ship sailed through a sky locked in perpetual twilight, the horizon bruised purple and black, as if the world outside no longer existed. A group of passengers, desperate for answers, forced their way into the captain's bridge. The heavy door swung open, but the room beyond was impossibly vast. It wasn't a control room at all. It was an ocean contained within the ship, stretching endlessly under a ceiling of iron beams. A single figure stood at the helm of a ghostly vessel sailing across that internal sea, the captain himself. His body was rigid, his eyes glowing faintly like lanterns in fog. He never spoke, never moved, yet every wave in that false sea mirrored the movements of the cruise liner above. The passengers tried to approach, but the floor beneath them dissolved into water. Some swam desperately. Others sank immediately, dragged down by pale arms rising from below. When the survivors scrambled back through the door, they found themselves not on the bridge but in their own cabins, soaking wet. The bridge was gone. Rumors spread of a locked deck no one had seen before, deep below the engines. Survivors whispered that those who vanished were taken there. One night, driven by terror and curiosity, a handful of passengers pried open a steel hatch and descended. They discovered a cavernous hall lit by sickly green lamps. Rows upon rows of dining tables stretched into the darkness, each seat filled by the missing. Families sat side by side, hands folded neatly, eyes open but unblinking. Their mouths moved silently, repeating words no one could hear. And at the head of every table stood faceless figures in crew uniforms, serving endless platters of meat that steamed but never cooled, pouring crimson liquid into crystal glasses. The smell was unbearable, sweet, metallic, wrong. Those who entered fled screaming, but not all escaped. When the group reunited later, 2 of their own were missing. By the next morning, those missing passengers were seen seated at the endless tables, smiling with empty eyes. Elsewhere, the entertainment continued. The ballroom's chandeliers swung violently, though no wind touched them. Music erupted from the grand piano, though no one sat at the keys. Passengers who tried to leave found themselves locked inside as invisible partners seized them, dragging them across the floor in endless waltzes. Their screams mixed with the melody until their throats bled. When the doors finally opened hours later, the ballroom was silent again. Only footprints in the dust showed that anyone had ever been there. The ship was no longer pretending to be a vessel of joy. Its disguise had been abandoned. Walls pulsed visibly now, veins of black water crawling through the wallpaper. Doors breathed, opening and shutting with sighs. The air itself felt alive, thick with moisture, carrying whispers in 1,000 voices. Survivors realized with growing dread that the ship wasn't just feeding on their fear, it was reshaping reality around it. It was becoming a world of its own, an endless labyrinth of hunger and despair. And the worst realization came when one passenger, delirious with terror, smashed through a porthole and leapt into the sea. The others rushed to stop him, but when they looked out through the broken glass, they froze in horror. There was no ocean at all. Beneath the ship stretched nothing. A black void, infinite and hollow, pulsed with faint glimmers of light that looked disturbingly like human faces floating in the dark. The ship wasn't sailing across water. It was drifting through something far older, far hungrier, and far more infinite than the sea. The survivors tried to cling to fragments of sanity, but the ship tore those fragments away with cruel precision. Each corridor changed the moment they turned their backs. A staircase that once led to the dining deck now rose into a ceiling of writhing shadows. A hallway that stretched only a dozen steps suddenly extended endlessly, lined with doors that whispered their names in distorted tones. Some opened those doors, unable to resist, and never returned. A mother searching for her son swore she heard him calling her name from the children's playroom. She rushed inside only to find the room filled with toys that moved on their own. Dolls twisted their heads, clapping in unison, Wooden trains rolled in perfect circles without tracks, and rocking horses bucked violently, as if invisible children rode them. In the far corner, she saw her boy's shoes, but when she reached for them, a dozen tiny hands gripped her ankles, pulling her down. The last thing she saw was the dolls smiling wider than their porcelain faces should allow. The others heard her screams fade into childish laughter, echoing through the ship for hours afterward. Elsewhere, a group of men tried to smash a lifeboat free from its chains. Their axes bit into the rusted links, sparks flying, hope burning in their eyes. But when they finally lowered the boat into the water, it didn't splash, it hung in midair. The ocean below had vanished again, replaced by a yawning void. One man leapt anyway, believing anything was better than the ship. His scream fell and fell, never fading, stretching into eternity until it became part of the wind itself. The others reeled the lifeboat back up, but it was empty. The theater became another trap. Survivors gathered there, hoping for shelter. But the red curtains rose on their own. A spotlight illuminated the stage, and one by one, passengers were dragged forward by invisible forces. They were made to perform plays they never knew, their bodies moving like puppets. A father recited lines in a language older than any tongue, blood spilling from his mouth with every syllable. A woman danced until her bones cracked audibly, her limbs bending at unnatural angles, her face frozen in a wide grin. The audience could not look away. When the curtains fell, half the seats were empty. And then came the night when the ship itself began to speak. At first it was only vibrations in the walls, like the deep rumble of distant thunder. But soon words formed, low, guttural, resonant. Passengers pressed their ears to the bulkheads and heard their own names whispered back, followed by secrets only they knew. One man heard the voice of his dead wife begging him to join her. Another heard the cries of the child he had lost years ago. Many broke under the sound, clawing at the walls until their nails tore away, desperate to reach the voices calling them. The survivors who resisted gathered in the atrium, clutching whatever scraps of hope they could find. They spoke of mutiny, of finding the engines and destroying them, of cutting the ship's heart out. But when they descended toward the engine room, they discovered it was no longer machinery. The pistons had become ribs. The turbines throbbed like lungs. The great central gear was a massive beating heart. It pumped a thick black liquid that reeked of salt and blood, flooding pipes that stretched into every deck. The crew uniforms littered the floor, empty but standing upright as though their wearers had dissolved into the ship itself. One survivor lifted an axe and swung at the heart. The blade sank in, but the heart did not bleed, it screamed. The sound shook the entire vessel. Lights shattered, walls buckled, and the floor split open to reveal chasms of roiling darkness. From that moment, the ship no longer tried to pretend. It shed its disguise, becoming a colossal living organism adrift in void. Decks tilted, hallways curled. Stairs led upward only to spiral back down, trapping passengers in loops of endless descent. The survivors realized the horrifying truth. They weren't passengers anymore. They were ingredients. The ship was consuming them slowly, savoring their terror, stretching out the feast for as long as possible, and the feast was far from over. The air inside the ship grew heavier with every passing moment. Breathing felt like inhaling damp cloth. The survivors stumbled through hallways that dripped with condensation, their footsteps echoing unnaturally, as though someone or something walked just a second behind them. One night, they gathered in the grand dining hall, too weak to keep wandering. Candles lit themselves along the tables, their flames flickering with a sickly green glow. Dishes appeared from nowhere, steaming roasts, baskets of bread, glasses brimming with red wine. The smell was intoxicating. Starving, trembling, some reached out despite warnings. The moment the food touched their lips, their bodies convulsed. One man gagged as worms spilled from his mouth. Another clutched his throat as the bread swelled, expanding inside him, suffocating him from within. Those who resisted could only watch in horror as their companions collapsed, twitching violently before being dragged away by invisible hands. Desperation twisted into madness. A preacher among them claimed the ship was purgatory, that they were meant to repent. He led a small group to the observation deck where he commanded them to kneel and pray. Lightning cracked across a sky without clouds, and for a moment the preacher's words seemed to hold power. But then the deck beneath them opened like a mouth. A massive tongue of black water surged upward, coiling around the kneeling passengers and dragging them into the void below. The preacher's screams rose last, echoing across the decks until they faded into silence. Others tried to send a signal. They broke into the communication room, smashing through locked doors and powered the ancient radio equipment. Static roared, but then faintly a voice answered. "We hear you," it said. "Hold on, we're coming." Relief swept through the group, until the voice began repeating itself, the same words again and again, growing more distorted each time. The survivors leaned close to the receiver. Their hope rekindled, but then the voice shifted. It began speaking their names, each one slowly, carefully, as if savoring them. Then came the laughter, low, wet, and endless. They smashed the radio to pieces, but even without power it kept laughing until the room itself collapsed inward. The survivors dwindled, yet the ship showed no sign of slowing. It glided through the void with impossible grace, its decks expanding and contracting like a living lung. The few who remained clung together, whispering plans they no longer believed in. They spoke of fire burning the ship from within, but flames sputtered out as soon as they were lit, smothered by the air itself. They spoke of jumping, but the void below now writhed with pale, reaching arms, thousands of them waiting patiently. At last they decided to confront the source directly. They would return to the heart of the ship, to the beating engine that pulsed with unholy life. Gathering what weapons they could, axes, knives, sharpened scraps of metal, they descended once more into the belly of the beast. The corridors narrowed, dripping black liquid, until they stood before the massive chamber again. The heart beat louder now, shaking the walls, sending vibrations through their bones. This time they did not hesitate. They attacked together. Blades sank into the flesh of the heart, tearing open great wounds. Black liquid gushed forth, burning their skin, searing their lungs. The ship screamed again, louder than before, a sound so powerful it cracked bones and shattered teeth. Passengers dropped to their knees, clutching their heads as blood poured from their ears. Yet they kept striking, driven by rage, despair, and the faint hope that pain could kill the monster holding them. The heart convulsed violently, beating faster and faster until the entire vessel shook. Decks above buckled, chandeliers crashed, lifeboats tore free and spun wildly into the void. Survivors screamed as they clung to the walls, fighting against the quake. Then with one final strike, the heart split open. For a moment, silence. Then the walls around them peeled away, revealing not the engine room but an endless horizon of flesh and bone, stretching in every direction. The ship wasn't a vessel. It had never been a vessel, it was a living creature, and they were inside it. The realization hit too late. The corridors sealed, trapping them in pulsating tunnels. The decks folded over, pressing down like jaws. The survivors scattered, screaming, but the ship's body moved faster than any human could. One by one they were crushed, absorbed, or swallowed whole by the living labyrinth. The ship feasted, and the void grew darker. The few who remained staggered through the ship's collapsing innards. Every step sank into quivering floors that pulsed like muscle beneath their feet. The walls shuddered with each heartbeat, slick with a black liquid that smelled of rot and salt. The ship's moans echoed everywhere, vibrating through the survivors' bones as if the vessel itself breathed through them. One man, his face gaunt, eyes wild, shouted that the only escape was through fire. He carried a torch stolen from the ballroom, the only flame that had survived. Its glow flickered unnaturally, casting long shadows that twisted like claws. With a desperate cry, he thrust it against the wall. For the first time, the ship reacted with true pain. The flesh hissed and curled, shrieking like 1,000 voices at once. Encouraged, the others gathered scraps, fabrics, anything that could burn, feeding the fragile flame until the walls erupted in greasy fire. The creature screamed, shaking violently. Passengers clutched railings as decks split apart. Through the cracks they glimpsed something worse than the void. Vast eyes staring back at them from below, lids blinking slowly, each larger than the ship itself. The ocean had never been there. The void was not empty. It was the body of the creature, infinite, stretching forever. The ship was merely a fragment of it, a lure cast into human reality. The flames spread, but they burned too brightly, too fast. Survivors coughed as black smoke poured from the walls. Some collapsed, overcome, their bodies swallowed by the living corridors. Only a handful staggered toward the top deck, believing fresh air would save them. They burst onto the open deck, gasping, and for a fleeting second, hope returned. Stars glimmered above. The ocean rippled below, but then the stars shifted, rearranging into a circle. They blinked, revealing themselves as more eyes staring downward. The waves below rose unnaturally high, curling upward like enormous hands. The survivors screamed, realizing the ocean was not water at all, but the creature's flesh mimicking the sea. Rising to reclaim them, one woman fired a flare gun, the red streak tearing into the sky. For a heartbeat, the flare illuminated the truth. The ship was not a ship anymore, but a vast carcass of bone and muscle. Its decks fused to a body that stretched endlessly into the horizon. The survivors stood not on wood and steel, but on the ribs of a living nightmare. The flare burned out, plunging them back into darkness. The ocean surged upward, engulfing the deck. Screams rose, cut short as the black waves crashed down, swallowing every last passenger. The ship shuddered once more, then grew still. The fire died. The smoke faded. Silence returned, and then, as if nothing had happened, the vessel straightened. Its decks repaired themselves, polished brass gleaming, lights flickering back to life. Music drifted faintly through the air. By dawn, it looked pristine again, a luxury cruise liner gliding peacefully across calm waters. At the port, a new group of passengers awaited boarding. They laughed, waved, and clutched their tickets eagerly. The crew welcomed them with warm smiles, guiding them aboard. No one noticed the way the ship's shadow stretched too far across the water. No one heard the faint whispers rising from the hull. The ship sailed smoothly, her polished decks gleaming, her crew smiling as if nothing had ever happened. Champagne flowed, music filled the halls, and passengers marveled at the horizon. To the untrained eye, it was paradise again. But the vessel's silence was deceptive. Beneath every laugh, every clink of glass, something stirred. The new passengers felt at first as small coincidences. A child insisted she heard someone whispering her name in the walls. A man swore he saw another passenger's reflection smiling when the real man's face was still. A woman found water dripping from her ceiling, though her cabin was on the highest deck. They dismissed it as nerves, seasickness, imagination. But the unease grew. Soon, shadows lingered longer than they should. Doors led to hallways that didn't exist on the map. At dinner, the chandeliers flickered, revealing unfamiliar faces seated among them. Pale, silent, watching. When the light steadied, those faces were gone, but their empty plates remained. The passengers whispered among themselves, convinced something was wrong. But whenever they tried to confront the crew, the smiling staff simply tilted their heads, their eyes glassy, their mouths moving in perfect unison. Welcome aboard. On the third night, the entertainment began. The grand theater filled, the curtains rose, and the stage revealed itself, not with actors, but with passengers from voyages long past. Their bodies were pale, their movements stiff, their eyes hollow. They performed endless plays, their voices chanting in languages no one could recognize. Some in the audience screamed and ran, but the exits had sealed. The rest sat frozen, unable to move, their eyes forced open by unseen fingers. When the curtain finally fell, no one remembered leaving. Yet the next morning, half the cabins were empty. The few who remained tried to warn others, but their words twisted in their mouths, spilling out in voices that weren't their own. Their friends recoiled, insisting they sounded like strangers. Some locked themselves in their cabins. Some leapt overboard, only to be seen hours later, dry and smiling, standing among the crew. And then came the revelation no one could escape. From the highest deck, a boy pointed at the horizon and screamed. The passengers rushed to see and gasped in horror. Far across the water, more ships appeared. Dozens, hundreds, all moving silently, their decks glowing faintly, their shadows stretching unnaturally wide. Each ship was identical, each cutting through the sea with eerie precision. And if one looked closely, the passengers aboard those distant ships were screaming silently, their mouths open wide, though no sound carried across the waves. The cruise ship was not alone. It was one of many. Predators disguised as paradise, drifting endlessly across the world, feeding in silence. The passengers collapsed in despair, their last shred of hope destroyed. They were not trapped on one cursed ship. They were trapped in a fleet that spanned oceans, a fleet that had sailed since time began, a fleet that would never stop. As the sun set, the vessel hummed, its lights glowing brighter, its decks polished, its halls echoing with laughter. The cycle continued. Somewhere a new port awaited. Somewhere, new passengers were already dreaming of luxury and escape. Somewhere another crowd clutched their tickets with joy, never realizing that the moment they stepped aboard they were already lost. The ocean was never water. The voyage was never leisure. The ship was never a ship, it was hunger, eternal and endless, and it was waiting. Welcome aboard.